In the early 1980s, the small Alaskan town of Craig was a quiet fishing community, far from the bustle of bigger cities. Life revolved around the sea, the seasons, and the hard work of commercial fishing. One of the most respected captains in the area was 28-year-old Mark Colthurst, who had earned a reputation for skill and determination. His vessel, the Investor, was a brand new 58-foot fishing boat, built to handle large salmon hauls and equipped with modern navigation gear. Mark's wife, Irene, also 28, and expecting their third child, often accompanied him on trips, along with their two children, Kimberly and John, aged 5 and 4. The Investor's crew consisted of 4 young men, Chris Heyman, Jerome Keown, David Moon, and Mike Stewart. All were drawn by the promise of steady work and the opportunity to learn from a skilled captain. Together, the 8 of them formed a tight-knit team that spent long days at sea, often battling rough waters and unpredictable weather. By September of 1982, the season had been highly successful, with full freezers and steady earnings. On September 5th, the crew docked in Craig to resupply and enjoy a short break, celebrating Mark's birthday with the local friends at a nearby restaurant. The town of Craig was small, home to just a few hundred people where everyone knew each other and word traveled fast. Many locals had worked alongside Mark or his family over the years, and the Colthursts were well liked by the community. Their arrival in the harbor brought a sense of excitement as families and crews returned from long trips with stories and catches to show. Life seemed ordinary, and the Investor represented not just work, but a symbol of dreams and hard-earned success. Despite the calm of the morning and the familiarity of the harbor, unknown dangers were already creeping closer. The combination of isolation, the transient nature of seasonal crews, and the wealth accumulated from the season created conditions where a single moment could change everything. No one on the Investor could have predicted the events that would unfold over the next day. What started as a routine docking and birthday celebration would soon turn into Alaska's most chilling unsolved tragedy. The community of Craig had never seen violence on this scale, and the townspeople took pride in their safe and predictable way of life. For the Colthursts and their crew, the trip had been a mix of work, family time, and camaraderie. Each member played a crucial role, from Mark steering the boat to the young crew handling the nets and engines. They were experienced, careful, and respected in their small world. The calmness of the harbor and the bright September sky gave no hint of the nightmare that awaited. On that morning, the Investor sat anchored quietly, with seagulls circling above and the distant mountains reflecting in the water. Supplies were being unloaded, ropes and nets checked, and plans were made for the next fishing expedition. Friends waved from the dock, unaware that this routine day would soon be marked forever in local history. The crew's routines, their laughter, and their sense of safety would all vanish in the hours to come. As the sun climbed higher, the Investor was still a symbol of achievement and family pride. Mark and Irene joked with the crew about the successes of the season, and Kimberly and John ran along the deck, enjoying the rare calm on land. The air smelled of salt water, fish, and fuel, familiar and comforting. Yet, even in this serene setting, the circumstances that would lead to tragedy were quietly converging, setting the stage for one of Alaska's most haunting mysteries. By the afternoon of September 5th, the crew had finished chores and secured the boat for the night. Conversations about home, plans for the future, and dreams for the next season filled the air. No one imagined that in less than 24 hours, the entire crew and the family aboard would be gone, leaving behind a town in shock and a case that would remain unresolved for decades. The Investor stood ready for departure, unaware that it was about to become the scene of one of the coldest and most perplexing crimes in Alaskan history. The calm of the Craig Harbor was shattered on the afternoon of September 6th, 1982, when thick black smoke began rising from the Investor. Locals initially thought the fire might be caused by engine trouble, a common hazard in the fishing industry. But as the flames grew higher and began spreading across the deck, it became clear that this was no ordinary accident. A few witnesses reported seeing a lone man in a small skiff leaving the area, rowing steadily away from the burning vessel and behaving oddly calm as the fire consumed the boat. Firefighters and authorities faced delays reaching the investor due to its secluded location in a quiet cove. When they finally arrived, the boat was engulfed, with fire consuming the superstructure and deckhouse. Despite their efforts, the blaze had destroyed much of the vessel, leaving charred remains and twisted metal. The water used to fight the fire also complicated later investigations, washing away potential evidence. Local residents watched in disbelief as a familiar sight, the pride of Craig's fleet, was reduced to burning wreckage before their eyes. When investigators were finally able to board what remained of the investor, they discovered the unthinkable. All 8 people aboard, the Colthurst family and their 4 crew members, were confirmed dead. Autopsies revealed that Mark and Irene Colthurst had been shot with a .22 caliber firearm before the fire was set. While the condition of the other victims made detailed confirmation difficult, authorities concluded that all had been killed prior to the flames. The fire, instead of masking an accident, had become a cover for a deliberate act of violence. The investigation immediately became complicated. Craig's small police force was not equipped to handle a case of this scale, and the remote location meant delays in gathering evidence. The burned wreckage, combined with the fire's destruction, made it nearly impossible to collect forensic clues, such as fingerprints or ballistic evidence. Investigators were left relying heavily on witness accounts and circumstantial leads to piece together what had happened in those final hours. One early lead focused on a former deckhand, John Peel, who had previously worked for Mark Colthurst but was not on the investor that season. Some locals reported seeing a man matching his description near the docks shortly before the fire, and the skiff witness also reportedly resembled him. These observations became central to the case, providing the only tangible link to a suspect in an otherwise baffling crime. Despite the uncertainty, authorities pursued Peel, believing he could be connected to both the fire and the killings. The scene at the harbor left the community in shock and fear. Neighbors and friends had watched the Colthursts and their crew go about their daily lives without any apparent threats. Now, the once safe town was faced with the reality that a mass murder had occurred in the heart of its working waterfront. Families wondered how such a calculated act could happen in a place where everyone knew one another, and the town's sense of security was permanently shaken. Investigators cataloged every detail they could, from the position of the boat in the cove to the direction of the smoke and the speed of the skiff's escape. The weather that day, clear but windy, may have contributed to the fire spreading so quickly, but it also helped eyewitnesses observe unusual activity. Pieces of burned equipment and scattered personal belongings were collected, though most were destroyed beyond recognition. Every fragment was carefully examined in an attempt to understand the sequence of events leading to the tragedy. By nightfall, the investor was reduced to a smoldering ruin, and the scale of the loss became clear. 8 lives had ended violently, and the evidence suggested planning rather than a spontaneous act. Authorities realized the investigation would be long and complex, requiring months of interviews, analysis, and careful reconstruction. For the small town of Craig, the horror of that September day would be remembered forever, as would the unanswered questions about who was responsible and why the tragedy had unfolded in such a remote and peaceful place. Following the devastating fire aboard the investor, investigators faced a daunting task. The burned wreckage, combined with water damage from firefighting efforts, had destroyed almost all physical evidence. Without fingerprints, murder weapons, or any clear forensic links, authorities had to rely heavily on eyewitness accounts and circumstantial evidence to try and solve the case. Every detail mattered, from the movements of locals near the docks to the sightings of the small skiff that had been seen leaving the burning boat. Early leads quickly focused on John Peel, a former deckhand who had worked for Mark Colthurst. Peel had been dismissed prior to the season, and investigators learned that he held a grudge over disagreements with the Colthursts. Some witnesses claimed to have seen a man resembling Peel near the harbor on the afternoon of September 6th, and his description also matched the skiff operator seen leaving the burning vessel. These accounts became critical in building a possible connection to the murders. Over the next several months, law enforcement in Alaska worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline. They interviewed friends, family, and residents of Craig, reconstructing the movements of the victims and potential suspects. Investigators examined Peel's past employment, his personal relationships, and any possible motives for revenge or financial gain. Despite the challenges of a remote location and limited resources, authorities remained focused on gathering every available piece of information. By 1984, 2 years after the tragedy, law enforcement had gathered enough circumstantial evidence and eyewitness testimony to make an arrest. John Peel was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder in connection with the deaths of Mark and Irene Colthurst, their 2 children, and the 4 teenage crew members. The case drew national attention due to its unusual circumstances, a mass killing in a small, close-knit Alaskan community, and a boat fire that masked the murders. During his initial questioning, Peel denied involvement. He maintained that he had not been near the investor on the day of the fire, and that he had no reason to harm the Colthursts or their crew. Investigators, however, noted inconsistencies in his statements, and the eyewitness accounts continued to suggest he had been present at the harbor that afternoon. Peel's defense argued that the sightings were unreliable, particularly given the stress and confusion surrounding the fire. The arrest of Peel marked the beginning of one of the most complex legal battles in Alaska's history. The case relied on a mix of eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence, with no direct forensic proof linking Peel to the crime. The lack of a murder weapon, absence of fingerprints, and destruction of the boat by fire created significant challenges for prosecutors seeking to prove Peel's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Meanwhile, the community of Craig struggled to process the events. Families of the victims were desperate for answers, but the limitations of the investigation left many questions unanswered. The notion that a former employee might have committed such a violent act added to the fear and uncertainty in the small town. Locals recalled the peaceful nature of the harbor before the tragedy, and the contrast made the murders all the more shocking. By the time the case went to trial in 1986, the legal teams were preparing for a highly scrutinized process. Prosecutors sought to tie Peel to the murders through testimony and patterns of behavior, while the defense aimed to highlight the lack of tangible evidence. The trial would test the ability of eyewitness accounts to carry the weight of such serious charges, and it would determine whether justice could be achieved for the 8 lives lost aboard the Investor. The trial of John Peel began in 1986 and quickly became one of the most closely followed legal proceedings in Alaska at the time. Prosecutors built their case on eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence, attempting to place Peel near the Investor on the day of the fire. They argued that Peel had the motive of resentment from his prior dismissal and sought revenge against Mark Colthurst, painting a picture of a calculated act. However, the defense immediately challenged the credibility of these claims. They pointed out that the eyewitness accounts were inconsistent, often given under stressful and confusing circumstances. No direct physical evidence, such as fingerprints, weapons, or traces linking Peel to the boat, existed. The fire had destroyed most of the potential forensic material, leaving the prosecution heavily reliant on testimony and conjecture. Throughout the trial, the jury was presented with a detailed timeline of the day of the fire, accounts from residents of Craig, and explanations of Peel's past employment with the Colthursts. Witnesses described seeing a man in a skiff near the harbor, but descriptions varied, and no one could definitively identify him as Peel. The defense emphasized these discrepancies, arguing that the uncertainty was too great to convict anyone beyond a reasonable doubt. After months of testimony and deliberation, the jury struggled to reconcile the evidence with the story being presented. They faced a difficult decision: convict based primarily on circumstantial evidence, or honor the legal principle that a person is innocent until proven guilty. In 1988, after the second trial, the jury reached a verdict. John Peel was found not guilty on all 8 counts of first-degree murder. The acquittal left the families of the victims devastated. While some believed Peel was the perpetrator, the lack of physical proof meant that the law could not hold him accountable. For the small town of Craig, the decision was a bitter confirmation that justice had not been served. Residents were forced to confront the reality that the mystery of the investor murders might never be solved. The court's decision also highlighted the challenges of investigating a violent crime in such a remote location. The destruction of evidence by fire and water, combined with the passage of time and limited forensic technology of the 1980s, made it nearly impossible to establish concrete proof. Law enforcement had done their best, but without hard evidence, the case had reached its legal limit. Following the acquittal, John Peel returned to private life, largely avoiding public attention. Meanwhile, investigators continued to receive tips and rumors, but none led to new arrests. The case remained open in Alaska, a reminder of how difficult it can be to solve crimes in isolated communities. The unresolved verdict also contributed to ongoing speculation and theories about what truly happened aboard the Investor. Residents, experts, and families of the victims were left with many questions and few answers. The trial itself became a landmark example of the limits of circumstantial evidence and the complexities of the justice system in handling extraordinary cases. With John Peel acquitted, the Investor case officially went cold, leaving the small town of Craig with more questions than answers. The investigation had consumed law enforcement resources for years, yet no other suspects emerged with credible leads. The lack of physical evidence and the remote Alaskan setting made it nearly impossible to rebuild the case against anyone else. Residents of Craig continued to talk about the tragedy, and the story became a permanent part of the town's history. Over the decades, several theories have emerged about what really happened aboard the Investor. Some still believe that Peel acted alone, taking revenge for a perceived grievance with a Mark Colthurst. Others speculate that the murders may have been connected to a transient fisherman or someone else entirely unknown, given the high pressure and sometimes volatile commercial fishing environment of the 1980s. Another theory suggests the fire was meant to conceal another motive, but investigators never found evidence to support it. The story of the Investor is often cited in discussions of Alaska's most chilling unsolved crimes. It highlights the dangers of isolated locations, the difficulty of investigating fires that destroy evidence, and the limits of eyewitness testimony. The case remains a cautionary tale for both residents and those drawn to remote, high-risk professions like commercial fishing. For the families of Mark and Irene Colthurst and the 4 young crew members, the tragedy left an enduring void. Decades later, the pain of losing their loved ones without justice is still felt. Memorials and remembrances in Craig serve as a quiet tribute to the 8 innocent lives lost that September in 1982. The Investor itself was never rebuilt, and the memory of the boat continues to haunt local lore. Photographs, reports, and newspaper articles from the time capture a community's shock and the enduring mystery of the fire and murders. Historians and true crime enthusiasts often revisit the case, examining the few remaining facts and the unanswered questions that surround it. Despite modern forensic advances, the case remains officially unsolved. No arrests have been made since Peel's acquittal, and investigators continue to list it among Alaska's coldest cold cases. The combination of fire, water, and time has permanently erased much of the evidence that could have led to a definitive conclusion. The Investor tragedy remains a somber example of how crime can touch even the most remote and peaceful communities. It also shows how the loss of evidence can leave a permanent gap in justice, where questions remain unanswered and families live with uncertainty. The events of September 5 and 6 1982, are remembered not just for the violence, but for the mystery that has never been solved. Even today, over 4 decades later, the story of the investor continues to intrigue and horrify those who hear it. The 8 victims are remembered as hardworking, ordinary people whose lives were cut tragically short. The unanswered question of who committed the murders ensures that this case remains one of Alaska's most haunting mysteries, a chilling reminder of how fleeting life can be and how some crimes leave their shadows forever.